Most of us think that Jesus was born in a cave or a stable. It's one of the most indelible images of the Christmas story. The Holy Family gathered around a manger surrounded by animals because there was no room for them in the inn. But the story we've been told is almost certainly untrue. Let's start by thinking a little bit about the location of the Nativity story. Both Matthew and Luke say that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but they both have slightly different ways of getting us there. In Matthew's story, Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem at the beginning, and then it's due to Herod's violence that they have to flee Bethlehem, so they flee to Egypt. And once Herod dies, they return, but due to continued fears that Jesus will be targeted by other people for violence, they decide to settle instead in Nazareth. In other words, it's only after the whole episode of being refugees in Egypt that Jesus' family moves to Nazareth. Whereas in Luke's story, Joseph lives in Nazareth at the beginning and then is forced to go to Bethlehem for the census. There's no mention of Herod or his violence. The family just returns again to Nazareth after the census is completed. Once again, what we're dealing with in these nativity stories is not historical narratives, but mythological narratives. Both Luke and Matthew knew that Jesus had come from Nazareth. He and his disciples were known as being Galileans, and yet they also knew that, according to the prophets, the Messiah was supposed to have been born in Bethlehem. And so somehow they each had to resolve this contradiction. Jesus had to somehow be both from Nazareth and from Bethlehem. Matthew and Luke solve this in different ways. Matthew solves it by having the family always have been from Bethlehem, but then have moved to Nazareth later due to fear of violence, whereas Luke solves it by having them have been from Nazareth, but had to return to Bethlehem due to the census of Quirinius. If you're like me, you've long carried around this image with you connected with the Christmas story of Mary and Joseph going from door to door, house to house, inn to motel to bed and breakfast in Bethlehem, knocking on the doors and pleading with the people to please give them a place to stay, only to be turned away by the heartless and indifferent crowds of Bethlehem. Many a nativity play even features an innkeeper as a character in the story, as if Mary and Joseph pulled their station wagon into a biblical Motel 6 only to find a no vacancy sign in the window of the motel. All of these references to inns and innkeepers come from one verse in the Gospel according to Luke, which is often translated, "And they laid him in a manger, for there was no room for them in the inn." But the word which is being translated as inn here is the Greek word kataluma, which is used elsewhere in the New Testament. Specifically, it's used in the Gospel according to Mark, where it's almost always translated upper room. It's that upper room, the one that Jesus instructs the disciples to go and prepare for their Last Supper together. The word kataluma almost certainly refers to a guest room, not to an inn. And if you think about it a little bit, it doesn't make sense for Mary and Joseph, in the context of Luke's narrative, to be trying to stay at an inn or at some random stranger's house. Precisely because in Luke's story, they're journeying to Bethlehem because this is Joseph's ancestral home. In other words, this is his hometown. His family lives here. If Joseph were going to visit his family, he would expect to be put up in their kataluma, in their guest room. But if the kataluma that Luke is referring to here is supposed to be Joseph's own family's kataluma, their own guest room, what does it mean when Luke says that there was no room for them in the guest room? Well, it probably doesn't mean that they were rejected, kicked out, forced to sleep on the street or in the stable or the cave of most nativity stories. In fact, Luke implies that they'd been staying there for a certain amount of time because it was while they were in Bethlehem that it came time for the child to be born. In other words, another common image of many nativity plays, Mary and Joseph arriving in Bethlehem on the very night that Jesus was born, as though Mary would be coming into Bethlehem riding on the back of a donkey in the midst of labor pains, is also probably wrong. Oh, and there's no donkey mentioned in Luke either. That's a traditional little gloss which Christians have liked to put in there because of the parallel that it creates with Palm Sunday when Jesus enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey. So if Mary and Joseph had been staying in Bethlehem for a little while already, they probably were staying in Joseph's family's kataluma, in their guest room. But what about that part where it said there was no room in the kataluma, Eric? Okay, so I've already discussed how the census that Luke describes is unrealistic, but within the logic of the narrative, if Joseph and Mary had to come to Bethlehem for the census. So did everyone else, including other members of Joseph's family, meaning that Kataluma is probably really crowded with people. Now let's say you're Mary and you're in this crowded family home surrounded by your in-laws when you go into labor. Are you going to want to do your laboring and to give birth surrounded by all of Joseph's uncles and cousins and aunts and who knows who else? The part about there being no room is best interpreted as referring to the childbirth itself. During childbirth, Mary and Joseph seek out a little bit of privacy. In a house crammed full of in-laws, the only place they can find to lay down their newborn baby is in a manger. Every other bed is taken. Of all the traditional elements of the Christmas story that we get wrong, this one about there not really being any inn, but instead Joseph and Mary probably staying with in-laws in Bethlehem, is the one that has the most theological impact, in my opinion. It makes a big difference whether we imagine Mary and Joseph going from door to door, knocking and begging for a place to stay, only to be rejected time and again until they finally have to make a place for themselves to sleep in a stable surrounded by animals, or whether we imagine them being in a family home surrounded by so many in-laws that there's no beds left for the newborn child to sleep in except for a manger. These two versions of the story have different theological resonance, and to be honest, I can see the value of both versions. The version where Mary and Joseph are rejected by the crowds in Bethlehem foreshadow the rejection of the Messiah by the crowds in Jerusalem later. But the version which is probably closer to what Luke intended is the version where Mary and Joseph are staying with in-laws in Bethlehem when the time for Jesus comes to be born. And this version of the story has the value of emphasizing Jesus' humanity, that he, like most people of his time, was born into a tribe, into a whole network of extended relatives, of family, of uncles and aunts and cousins and grandmas and grandpas, that women and men cooed over him and counted his little toes and admired every little hair on his head, that he was surrounded with love and affection like every infant deserves, because that too is part of the human experience. It wouldn't be accurate at all to say that there is no compassion, that there is no hospitality, that there is no love and fellow feeling among humanity, because there is. And so perhaps it's time for us to set aside the version of the story that says that humankind rejected Christ from his birth, and instead embrace the version of the story that says that Christ was surrounded from his birth and throughout his life by some people who did know how to love and who were courageous in loving one another, and that Christ came to build upon and to expand upon that aspect of humanity to create a community of courageous and loving people, the kind of community that doesn't turn away people experiencing homelessness or refugees, even when the guest room is already full.